evening, everyone, and welcome to Parliament. I'm delighted that we were able to host the event for teaching leaders here this evening. And a very, very big thank you, James, to you personally and to teaching leaders for the inspiring work that you are doing and your inspiring plans for the future. I think the Teaching Leaders Quarterly publication is already proving its value in promoting debate both amongst practitioners and policymakers, and I think the focus of tonight on talent is an excellent focus for our discussion. I often start speeches or remarks about education by going back to first principles and talking about the purpose of education, and I like in doing that to restate the inherent, the intrinsic value of education in and of itself, because I think we in politics tend to focus a lot on the economic value of education, but actually there is that inherent value. But also, I think very importantly, the social justice argument for education and the potential for successful education in areas of greatest social and economic need to be part of a broader strategy about creating a fairer and more just, a more equal society with greater levels of social mobility. And yes, of course, education is part of the way in which we address this country's economic challenges going into the future. Looking at the latest edition of Teaching Leaders Quarterly, which has an article by Christine Quinn, the principal at the Nine Styles Academy in Birmingham, looking at Christine's introduction to her own school on the school website earlier today, she emphasises the importance to the individual student of both examination results and personal development. And I think one of the many, many false choices that we are often confronted with in debates on education is the suggestion that you can either be a successful school in terms of your results, or you can be a successful school in terms of inclusion and personal development for young people. I've always believed that the best schools seek to achieve both of those things, and actually achieving one can reinforce the achievement of the other. So a big question for us tonight is how we can both attract and retain in our, the best talent in our schools, and in particular how we can do that in schools that serve the areas of greatest social and economic need. In my article in the latest edition, I refer to research which the London School of Economics did for the Sutton Trust, which showed that if the least effective 10% of teachers moved up to simply match the average performance of teachers in English schools, then we would move into being firmly one of the top 5 achieving education systems in the world. And I spoke in a speech just before Christmas about the new arcs of underachievement, drawing on my own experience in government with the London Challenge. Last week, Centre Forum with ARC schools published The Tale, How England Schools Fail One Child in Every 5. And I think publications like that remind us of the enormity of the challenge that we face. And when I joined the DFES, as it was then, just over a decade ago, and was asked to take on responsibility for what became known as the London Challenge, this was seen as a very, very difficult job for us all to do. And I was delighted when we got Tim Brickhouse to come and head up the work that we were doing. We got John Coles, one of the best civil servants in the department, heading it up at the official level. But at that time, secondary schools in London were performing significantly below the national average. And I think learning the lessons from London Challenge is vital for our future policy development, and making sure that we learn the correct lessons from the evidence of what actually happened through London Challenge. So, for example, the significant impact of the London Challenge advisors in playing a role working across and between schools to improve and retain the quality both of leadership and of teaching in general. We saw through that challenge a narrowing of the attainment gap. We saw some amazing advances in some of the toughest neighbourhoods in London, but we know that in London there is still much more that needs to be done. But what I want to do is take the evidence of that programme, the evidence of other challenges, including the Greater Manchester Challenge and National Challenge, and identify where today we have significant areas of underperformance and underachievement. And much of this will be familiar to you. The increasing evidence about the scale of challenge faced in many coastal towns, in seaside resorts, and in some, but certainly not all, of our northern towns and cities. And I was delighted to be with James recently in Knowsley, where the programme welcoming the teaching leaders focus in these areas, and the programme Achieve Together, which is being launched by yourselves and Teach First, a crucial programme for communities like Knowsley. And we were discussing this just before coming on here this evening. You get Liverpool, where I'm now an MP, Knowsley next door, and yet very different performance between two authorities which in many ways have schools and communities that are remarkably similar. What are the lessons that we can learn from those neighbouring communities and the progress that's been made in some schools but not in others for the future? Let me then just say something about freedom and the importance of freedom to innovate. And people often talk about money, and one of the challenges that I will have if Labour wins the next election is that we're not going to have the sort of extra public money that education had for most of the time that I was a minister 10 years ago for programmes like London Challenge and building schools for the future. So we need to look at what we can do in a context of very constrained budgets. But I think the evidence that you're giving to us is that money, whilst it always matters and it always helps, isn't the only answer to some of the challenges that we face. I'm very clear, for example, that if there remain regulations which are preventing the kind of innovation that we need in our schools, I'm absolutely open to ensuring that those regulations are removed or reformed. But I'm struck, just going around the country as well as looking at the research evidence, that there is plenty of innovation happening in schools of all types, in all types of community around the country now. And I'm often struck that the barriers to innovation are often about confidence, having the confidence to innovate, the confidence to do things differently. And I think programmes like yours are very much about how we can ensure that confidence is spread right the way across the system. I've spoken about the importance of evidence in future policy making. I've just come here from doing a web chat with the Times Education Supplement, where one of the questions was, if you get in 2015, will you reverse everything that they've done? People generally ask that because they want me to say yes to that question. And what strikes me when I go around the country is that people say that a real weakness of the English education system is the constant chopping and changing between different governments. In fact, worse than that, the constant chopping and changing between different secretaries of state, even when they're in the same party. And I looked at the last 2 decades, the last 20 years, there have been 10 different secretaries of state, and we've seen a lot of change, but we've also seen a lot of chopping and changing. And I think we need to get to a position, firstly, where evidence is far more at the heart of policy making, secondly, where evidence is used far more intelligently in schools and in local communities, and ideally to a position where we have a much greater, broader, cross-party consensus on education, because I think that's in our interest. And that's certainly what has happened in most of the countries that have far more successful records on education than we do. And I finish really with this point. I think a real strength of London Challenge was about collaboration. And the piece of work that the RSA and Pearson did, the Academies Commission report, I think is well worth people reading if you haven't yet had an opportunity to do so, because it absolutely restates the crucial role that collaboration between schools plays. And I think this has big implications for national policy, in terms of the future of the middle tier in education, in terms of the incentives and accountability regime that exists for education, but also the responsibility on people like me to support organic initiatives like this one that have at their heart collaboration, not as some soft, easy ride, but collaboration absolutely as a means to bringing about school improvement in schools right the way across the country. and that's why I'm so delighted to be here with you, and so pleased to give my support to the brilliant work of teaching leaders.